Yeah, because maybe you change something, you know.
I start recording and streaming so that later when the symposium starts, I have nothing to do. Okay, if you don't mind, because otherwise I'm always afraid to forget it. Okay. Registrazione in pausa. Okay. Ready?
Yes, I'm gonna tell them that go first. Yo. Yes. You can go first. So Franca will go last, and then you start, and then we pick it up here.
All right, sounds good.
Okay.
Okay. Should I just start now, or is it?
I don't know. Are we waiting still for people? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. We're waiting a few more minutes because they at late, so we'll wait. We will like. You can start if you want.
I will get us started then. So today I would like to talk a little bit about confidence in hypothesis testing. So having confidence in our own research, having confidence when we read other people's research and their hypothesis testing. And I want to talk about this and some thoughts of mine regarding this in the context of the underlying multiverse of outcomes. And I will describe soon what I mean by this. And as I go through this, I will mention things like selective reporting, including p-hacking, pre-registration, and a little bit about meta-analysis as well. Oh, let's see. So this talk is based on this paper we recently uploaded as a preprint together with Robert van Elst, Marian Bakke, and Giulio. This is the original title of this talk as well. If you want to check out this paper, you can see the link here in the bottom right throughout the talk, and I will make sure to upload the slides of this talk as well. So when we talk about the multiverse, what do we mean? Just a moment. Well, if you, like me, you grew up reading lots of comics or science fiction, or if you've been looking at some of the superhero movies that have been coming out recently, I think you will have a pretty good idea or pretty good intuition for what we mean by the multiverse, also in statistics and research. And I can also totally recommend this particular movie if anyone's interested in animation. But fundamentally what we mean is just that as time passes, we encounter a decision at some point, and we make this decision. If we have a binary choice, we make one of the two decisions. But which decision we make is very dependent on the context and the situation. So we could have very reasonably, or just as well, if the situation had been different, made the other choice. And there's no real reason to prefer one of these choices to the other. So we should put them out as comparable options. Of course, in research, we have really a lot of decisions happening all the time. We start, of course, we have our theory, and we do some research questions, we operationalize, and we develop a design to study this, collect our data, process our data, analyze this somehow. And in all of these stages, we have a lot of different decisions we need to make, some where it's clear what matters, but many decisions where there's no real strong guidance. And I think in psychology, we often have theory that's not very mathematically precise. So we end up with decisions that within the context of our theory have many reasonable alternative decisions that we could make. And I think Stegen et al. Is the one who minted this very nice term, the multiverse, for this. And it is really fundamental that the multiverse alternatives are approximately equally reasonable. And there is no reason why we should prefer one to the other. That, in essence, means that these decisions are arbitrary. And some people refer to these as researchers' degrees of freedom, which you might have heard about. So we can take some examples of this to make this more concrete. If we're doing some kind of research and we, within the context of our theory, only want to include young adults. Well, one way to define this is to look at the biological age and say, well, we only think the people that are 18 to 23 counted young alone. So we could just as well say, or someone else would say, well, 18 to 24 is a much more reasonable span for young adults. Or perhaps 18 to 30, if you're like me, about 30 already, you think that, well, I'm still quite young. And there's no, often in the context of theory, there's no strong borders between these different decisions. And I think this is even more clear with the second example here, where we can have some training tasks, for example, and this example comes from the ego depletion literature, where participants are doing some training task and then they're going to do the real task, but we only want participants who are really paying attention, right? Because otherwise perhaps our intervention will not work or whatever it can be. So we might decide that, well, we'll only include participants who have a certain percentage correct on our training task, because that's the minimum that we can expect them to actually do if they're paying some attention. So we might then say, well, we're going to exclude any participants who have less than 99% correct, or perhaps 95 or 80%. And between all of these, I think in many situations, we could come up with stories behind why one percentage is more appropriate than the other percentage. But if we start really digging into this and we look at this in detail, well, what about 80% versus 81%? I think at this point, it gets very difficult to have a real reason why these decisions are not arbitrary. Or we can even keep going and say 81% versus 81.3%. So there are many decisions that are to some extent arbitrary, and sometimes it's only obvious when we do this kind of pushing it to the extreme. But many decisions, I think, in our research process are essentially arbitrary within the context of our guiding theory. My concern with this is that if we have a number of these decisions, so say we only have 10 decisions that are arbitrary, and I think often we have many more than this, but if we have 10 decisions that are arbitrary and these have a binary choice with only 2 possibilities, then suddenly we already have about 1,000 possible outcomes or decision combinations that we could have decided on. So we could compute 1,000 effect sizes from this, depending on the decision combinations. And some of these effect sizes will overlap, but a lot of them will not. So how do we pick between these 1,000 effect sizes? And this quickly becomes even more problematic, because if we have 3 choices each for these 10 decisions, which again, I think is not very unusual at all, but these 3 choices are all reasonable again. Then suddenly we have 60,000 possible decision combinations. So the number of possibilities expands very quickly. And again, some of these, if you compute these 60,000 effect sizes, some of these will overlap, but a lot of them will not. And to make this more concrete, here's an example from this paper that we recently did. This is from where in this paper we looked at the arbitrary choices in a couple of registered replication reports as if they weren't pre-registered. This is from the RR4, which is on ego depletion. And we use the protocol here to just identify moments in this post-processing of the data that were arbitrary decisions. For this particular example, we identified 20,000 possible outcomes, which again, I think is quite common in a lot of research. And you see here on the y-axis, we have the sample size, because a lot of our decisions were about excluding participants or not. On the x-axis, you have the effect size, and the lines you see on the sides here in this plot are the funnel lines, which means that anything outside of these lines is significantly different from 0 at the alpha 0.05 level. And the colors in this plot just indicate where more of the effect sizes ended up located. And I think that we look at this, and if I look at this and I think about this being a study, I would have some concerns, because I would think, well, normally we don't see these 20,000 outcomes. We only see 1 or 2 of these outcomes. But if I know that I have just one or two of these outcomes, and I have this large spread of possible outcomes. Here you see we have a spread that goes from below 0 to 0.5 standard deviations, which is very large, considering the median effect size in psychology is more like something 0.1 or 0.15. So it makes me concerned then when, if I do research and I have one effect size or a few effect sizes, or if I read other people's research and I see one effect size or a few effect sizes, I would like to know, well, how does this relate to all these possibly 20,000 or more underlying effect sizes? And even more importantly, perhaps, I would like to know that this effect size was not selected in a biased way. You see here that only a few of these are outside of the funnel lines, right? That they are significantly different from 0. So we want to know that the results we're reading or that we're ourselves reporting are not selectively reported. What I mean by this is that when we have multiple statistical results that we examine and not to report all of them. So I think this plotter is actually pretty good. The multiverse plot that I've done there is a pretty good illustration of the potential for selective reporting in a study. And selective reporting doesn't have to be intentional. Of course, it's often related to significance. I think many of us know at this point that there's a shockingly high number of significant results in psychology, more than there should be. And partly this is because, well, it's very easy to kind of trick ourselves. That selective reporting, we can run some analyses, and it's very easy to convince ourselves that the analyses that worked out, so to speak, were the ones we intended all along. Or we just forget some of the analysis we run, and we don't report all of them. And this affects the context of our reported results and makes them less reliable, or we can have less confidence in them. Of course, we also have the other side where people do intentional p-hacking. They run multiple studies and they really just look for those significant results. But I think we and most people are not intending to at least do something spurious. We're looking for significant results because we know that these are the good results that we would like to have, typically. Or this tells us that there is something happening. We would like something to happen when we're doing research because we're interested in what we're doing, right? So I'm concerned about this multiverse, both because of the spreads of effect sizes and because of the risk of selective reporting. And I'm also concerned because, well, if this happens in single studies, then what happens with meta-analysis? So if we have 20,000 effect sizes in one study, what about when we have 16 studies and each of these has 20,000 effect sizes? Well, that means that depending on the decisions that people make in these studies, we have 20,000 raised to 16 possible resulting meta-analyses. So these things really make me wonder, well, how can we be confident in the results of a meta-analysis, and how can we be confident in the results of just single studies when this is the case? So I would like to talk a little bit about this, and I'm really talking about multiverses, this idea of the arbitrary decisions that we have underlying our final reported results. So I'm not going to talk anything about particular forms of hypothesis testing, like Bayesian or frequentist or anything else. One way to increase our confidence is to do a pre-registration. And it's a bit unfortunate our colleague who is going to delve deeper into pre-registration is not here today, because I think pre-registration is one of the very important tools we have at our disposal these days for doing hypothesis testing. And what it does is it makes it transparent which decisions we were intending to do and which ones we were not originally intending to do. So which decisions might have been affected by things like confirmation bias, impact bias, or even in the worst case, something like p-hacking. Although I think in that case, people probably avoid pre-registration. It makes these things more transparent. It doesn't, here it looks like we're just picking one, then we don't do any other decisions, but it's still possible to do pick other decisions. It's just transparent then that we have done so. So we typically then with the pre-registration, we end up with one primary outcome, and this outcome is somewhat unbiased. At least we hope so. We avoid the risk of confirmation bias and insight bias to some degree, depending on pre-registration. And what's encouraging is that, well, from a meta-analytic perspective, this might be enough. If we have primary studies that are pre-registered, then this allows us to examine those pre-registrations, and we can do a risk of bias analysis to look for selective reporting. And we can code which studies we think might have some risk of bias and which ones we think do not. And this example here shows why this is important. So the gray curve you see here is showing the distribution of all possible meta-analysis, these 20,000 raised to 16 meta-analysis that we saw before. And the tail is, of course, very small. And we see that, well, the pre-registered effect, in this case, happens to be pretty central. And it might be because by doing a pre-registration, we select from the multiverse in an unbiased way. And if we have multiple studies selecting from the multiverse in an unbiased way, well, the average of these will end up more or less in the center of our multiverse distribution when we're doing meta-analyses. And of course, if we were completely unbiased and if we have an unlimited amount of studies, we'll get a perfect centrality of this meta-analytic summary then. And we also can see here, well, this other, the yellow star, the most significant version, is when all of these 16 studies just picked the most significant results. We're p-hacking everything to hell and high water. And then we get results that are very, very far out in the tail end of the multiverse distribution. And we can, and I think in general, if we look at meta-analysis, then we want our meta-analysis, if we're going to be confident in the results of meta-analysis, to have evaluated all the included studies for risk of bias, for selective reporting. And if they haven't done so, I personally would not trust any meta-analysis outcome. I would assume it's highly biased. And if they include some of the studies that they think might be at risk of bias, well, then we should assume that it's to some degree biased, but there's really no way to know to what extent, because it really depends on the sampling error in the underlying studies. Of course, we don't just care about meta-analysis, right? We don't want to run a study and then just have this as a placeholder with someone in the future to run a meta-analysis on. We want to learn something from the studies that we ourselves are doing. So pre-registration, I think, is a very good first step, because we, to some degree, we remove the bias risk here. But still, we end up with this result, and we look at this plot, and we know that, okay, well, our pre-registration is just one or a few out of these 20,000 possible results. So how can we be confident about where it is located amongst the multiverse? So pre-registration increases our confidence in the results. I think it's not sufficient to be confident. We also want to decrease our multiverse if it's possible. So, and I think this is very possible. Like in our research, in this project we did, we looked at about 10 different designs of studies. And one of these, we had about 1.5 million decision combinations, which is, of course, a crazy number of possibilities. And in our smallest study design that we looked at, we only had about 4,000. So I know that if I saw one of these two, and if someone tells me, well, my result is 1 out of 1.5 million or 1 out of 4,000, I would trust one of these much more than I would the other one. And we can encourage this by doing at least 2 things. And there might be more things, but these are the things I'm aware of right now. We can pre-establish our exclusion criteria and pre-filter participants. What I mean by this is that we decide who we're going to exclude before we collect data, and then we don't collect data on those people. We have some kind of pre-questionnaire so we can filter them out. This decreases the possibilities, the research degrees of freedom in our study. Another very helpful thing we can do, and perhaps even more helpful, is that we shouldn't collect variables in our research studies unless we have a very clear reason for collecting them. Because if we do, this allows us or allows other people to use this data to either exclude people or use them as different covariates or other potentially arbitrary choices within the context of our theory. And as you realize, I'm sure that these two, of course, work very well together with pre-registration. They have an amazing synergy, if I can use that word. So that I think is another reason for us to be motivated to use pre-registrations. It really helps us think about our study in advance, not waste our participants' time, decrease the amount of multiverse possibilities, and increase the confidence in our study. After you collect the data, you can of course also do a multiverse analysis yourself to put your results more in context of where are they located. So you can think about, well, in my research, which decisions are more or less arbitrary, and you can think of what are the reasonable alternatives to these. And if we do this, I think we get pretty far on the way to having confidence in our research from the multiverse perspective, at least. So to summarize this, so to have confidence, I think there are many things that we can do, and that probably there are many things I missed. But some of the things we can do to increase our confidence, both in our own hypothesis testing and reading other people's hypothesis testing, keeping in mind that there is an underlying multiverse of possibilities from under any reported result, is that we can pre-register our research. We try to minimize how large our multiverse will be in advance. We can put our results into context by performing a multiverse analysis. And if we're doing a meta-analysis, if we're reading other people's meta-analysis, we really want to have an analysis of risk of bias, like reporting in it. Otherwise, I think there's very little confidence I would have in it. And these things will get us pretty far, I think. But still, of course, some caveats that we always have many other pretty serious problems. We have publication bias, we have the connection between theory and our operationalization. And of course, perhaps one of the big ones that I hope you will hear very interesting things about today is measurement concerns. So that's all I wanted to say today. And I think we have maybe a few minutes for talks, for questions, if I haven't gone too far. I will open the table now if anyone wants to ask questions.
Hi, Anton. Maybe if there is a very quick question, we have time for one. Looking around, or someone online. I don't see anything, but you can always send a message in the chat or just email Anton, I guess, in case you have some. Yeah, you also have my email available here on the slide. So if you have a question later on or something, or you want to make some comments or discuss something, you're very welcome to email me. Okay. Well, thanks a lot then, Anton. Okay. Let's see. Can I move directly to our presentation? Share my screen, I guess. Oh yeah, Anton, can you stop the sharing, please?
Yeah, I think I already stopped it.
Okay.
Mute myself as well.
I think we stopped. Can we share ourselves? Okay. Okay. Welcome everyone, and thanks a lot for being here. I'm very happy to present here together with Esther this project on it's a systematic review of measurement invariance in psychology. And before going into the study that we performed with Esther, I would like to create some common ground and talk about measurement invariance first. So what does it entail and why is that important? And I think the best way to talk about measurement invariance is just to start with an example. So let's imagine that I'm a researcher and I want to investigate the compliance to COVID-19 guidelines. And as many constructs in psychology, of course, I cannot directly observe this construct. So what I can do is instead using a proxy for this. And that basically means having a scale. So I have an observable construct here, which would be my compliance to COVID-19 guidelines, and I have a scale, which in this case, say, is composed by 3 items measuring this construct. And the scale here would be, am I moving there? Okay, so that's sorry, but you can also see, oh yeah, okay. Okay, yeah. So I have these 3 items here. I have these items on keeping distance, wearing a face mask, and washing hands. And I assume that these 3 items measure compliance to COVID-19 guidelines. So say that my question is to basically, and I will call this scale from now on TTC19. So let's say that I want to compare 2 groups with regards to this construct, and I want to compare Dutch and Italians. So what I would do, I would just take this scale, this questionnaire, and administer it to the Italian group, to a sample of Italians, and to a sample of Dutch participants. And then I would have here my grouping variable. And what I would do basically is just to compare, say, the mean score of this scale between these 2 groups. So what I'm interested in here, and I'll show you graphically, is basically just comparing this kappa here, the mean score on this scale across these 2 groups. So far this seems pretty okay, right? That's what happens a lot in psychology every day. But of course, this is only the surface of the iceberg, because when we decide to compare mean scores across groups, what we're actually saying is that this scale has a certain measurement model, which I'm here showing you in this slide. And if I would just follow the steps I said, so take the scale, administer it, and compare the mean scores, I would assume that these 2 measurement models Oh, sorry. Okay, no problem. Yes. Big spoiler. Okay. How can I... Is it now okay? Online? No. Ok. Let's see. Come lo faccio quindi? Vado da qua. Sorry, there's a technical. Yeah.
Stai già condividendo? Ok, da dove è arrivato?
È arrivato.
Questa. Ok. Bene. No, questa. Posso nascondere?
Okay. So now online is good, I hope. If not, let me know. Thanks a lot. So I was saying basically here we have this measurement model. So now we should see it also online, I hope. So we have this measurement model here, and we assume that all these parameters are exactly the same across groups, which is quite an assumption, I would say. So what we can do instead is just test whether all these parameters here are the same across groups. And just to give a very short description of these parameters, here I indicate, for example, that I want to check whether the factor loadings are the same across groups, meaning the strength of the relationship between each item and the latent construct with compliance to COVID-19 guidelines is the same across groups. Or we should also check whether the intercepts are the same across groups. So what we should do, instead of just taking a scale and abruptly compare the mean score across groups, is actually test whether all these parameters here, this one and this one, all these parameters here are the same across groups. How do we do that? We do it by measurement invariance. So basically, if I wanna make this safe, if I wanna have a safe assumption that the scale functions equivalent across group, I have to test for measurement invariance. Measurement invariance must hold in order to compare these two groups, and then I can compare them. How do we do that? Very briefly. I would only talk about the confirmatory factor analysis approach, not because I have a preference for it, but just because it's the one most commonly used. But of course, you can do this in many ways, but I will only follow this confirmatory factor analysis approach. So normally what we want to test is basically, we have a stepwise approach to test whether this whole measurement model is the same across these two groups. And the first step that we normally take is testing for configural invariance. And what I mean by that is testing basically whether the structure of the construct is the same across groups. In this case, whether these three items here are measuring this latent construct, both in the Italian group and in the Dutch group. How do we do that? Basically, we just fit our factor model. We constrain the model to basically have these three items loading on this latent factor for both groups, and then we check the fit of the model, and we conclude whether measurement invariance hold or not. If it does hold, then we can move to the next step. That's great. If it doesn't, then we should not proceed. And here we have, for example, a case where this doesn't happen. You see that this item here, washing hands, does not relate at all to compliance with COVID-19 guidelines in the Dutch. And we can then, of course, speculate why that is the case or investigating. But let's assume for now that this holds, and we move on to the next step, which is the one of metric invariance. So we check whether the loadings, this parameter here indicated with lambda, are the same across these two groups. We do it in the same way as before. We start with the model we had before. We just impose additional constraints on these loadings here. And then we fit the model. We check whether the fit is good enough in both groups. If that's the case, great, we proceed forward. What if that's not the case though? Shall we just drop our research? Of course not. There are options for that. We could investigate, for example, whether this is related only to one item. And then we could decide whether this item might actually function differently in one group instead of the other. And why do we want to do that? Why do we want to have measurement invariance? Because if that's not the case, we might run into issues because, for example, the scores of the scores of two subjects on the scale. So if two subjects, have the same item score, they might not have the same score on the scale, which is something that should not be the case. We want these lines ideally to overlap. So one group, in this case group 2, will have biased scores compared to the other. So we want to make sure that this scale functions equivalently. But again, say that this is the case, we move forward. And we again, they do the same steps now with the intercepts. So these parameters here, we just constrain them to be equal. And if we fit the model and we see that the fit is good enough, then great, we proceed forward. If not, then you might run into issues because again, here you see that the scores on one group are biased compared to the other. But again, like before, we can, of course, allow for some partial invariance or some items to differ across groups and still proceed with our investigation. But if these three levels hold, then we're safe. We can actually then compare the mean scores across these two groups. And I want to really make clear that in order to compare these two parameters here, so this kappa, we really need both loadings and the intercepts to be invariant. Otherwise, we would really, have problems and when comparing these two groups. Our differences could not be due to the real differences between Italians and Dutch, but due purely to the fact that the scale works in a different way. So I think, that's what we can do. But of course, this was our starting point with Esther, and then we asked ourselves, does this actually happen in psychology?
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Damiano just gave you a tutorial on measurement invariance, and I will now discuss our study. So basically, the question that we had was, does this really happen? Do people do measurement invariance checks? And this was our research question. So to what extent is measurement invariance assessed in articles that use psychological scales? So our study basically collected a lot of other articles, and we were interested in articles that adhere to two criteria. The first, we wanted articles that made a comparison between groups. So for example, control and treatment, or over time, baseline treatment 6 weeks later, for example. And we wanted articles that used reflective factors. And reflective factors, we defined them according to this. There are three criteria that we adhere to. So we assumed that the authors used a reflective factor, so a factor with arrows going down, if they made a reference to a validated scale. So if you would use BDI-2 for depression, we would like to see a reference to Beck or to another validation study. Then psychometric properties. So if they did not use a reference to a validated scale, but if they mentioned factor analysis, we would think, okay, it's a reflective factor. Or if they did not do that, any internal consistency measure, which was in 95% of cases Cronbach's alpha, also indicated to us a reflective factor. So these were the articles that we were interested in, and our study consists of two parts, a reporting part and a reproducibility part. We only investigated articles that had open data, that shared their data online, and as such, we could not only assess what they reported, but also, if they did a measurement invariance check, we could try to reproduce that check. Or if they did not do a measurement invariance check, but they had to do a measurement invariance check, we could do it for them. So that's the outline of our study. And we're going to talk about the reporting part first. So what we did is we took two flagship journals in psychology, namely Psychological Science and PLOS ONE. And for Psychological Science, we took all the articles from 2018 and 2019 that shared their data. And that was 213 articles. And because we wanted to make it even, we also sampled 213 articles from PLOS ONE. Well, some articles contain multiple studies, multiple comparisons. So these 213 for each actually ended up being almost 1,900 studies that we checked. Of course, not all of these studies were eligible for inclusion. Some of them dropped out because it was, for example, a study with animal data, or a simulation study, or a meta-analysis. So these dropped out. Then group comparisons. If they did not do any group comparisons, the article was of no interest to us. So these dropped out. No scale. If they only used one item, then of course not relevant to us. And finally, no reflective factor. So they did not use any of the three criteria that we just mentioned. In the end, we ended up with almost 100 articles and still 912 comparisons. And to be clear, all of these 912 comparisons should have done a measurement invariance check because they compared groups on a reflective factor. So we go to the results. On the top, you can see the sample that we're speaking of right now, which is the 96 articles. And before I start talking about measurement invariance, one interesting result here, we checked whether they use an existing scale, so a reference to, for example, the BDI-2, or whether they used an ad hoc scale. And with ad hoc scale, we mean maybe a scale that was completely made up by the researchers, or a scale that existed, but had some items deleted, or some items added, or some items edited. And quite surprising to us is that the vast majority used an ad hoc scale, especially in psychological science. Many people make adjustments to scales. And you can do this, it's totally fine, but you need to validate the scale then, again, because you cannot say for certain that the scale that you are using actually measures the thing that you are interested in. So that's an interesting result. As a side note, then the measurement invariance results. Again, we of these 912, all of them should have done measurement invariance check. And as you can see, only 41 did. So that's quite problematic, we think. Of those 41, they did some form of measurement invariance test, but we took a bigger look into what exactly that they have done. So we drop out all the other studies, they're not relevant to us anymore. And we now only look, as you can see on the top of the screen, to the 41 comparisons that actually did a measurement invariance check. Also interesting to note, it was only in 7 articles in total, so there is quite some nested data in this. So how many of those found full measurement invariance? And we define full measurement invariance as either metric, scalar, configural, but not partial invariance. And here you can see the results are quite okay, I would say. 24 and +1 reported having some form of measurement invariance, and for psychological science, the vast majority did as well. So we took an extra look to those studies, and we see the level of measurement invariance found. And as you can see here, 2 and 1 in psychological science have scalar invariance. And if you remember Damiano's tutorial from before, if you want to make a group comparison between groups, if you want to estimate a mean, a Cohen's d, for example, do a t-test, you have to have scalar invariance. So that means out of the 912 comparisons that were made, only 3 adhered to the criteria that were actually needed. Of course, it could be that all the other studies also did a measurement invariance check, but we could not find it. So if it was not reported, then of course we couldn't find it. So regarding the reporting, 25% of our sample actually compared groups over time with a reflective factor. Of all those studies, only 4% did a measurement invariance check. The level of measurement invariance found is often not enough to make valid mean comparisons, and the reporting standards on measurement invariance are quite low. In measurements in general, it was very hard for us to find out how many items a scale had. If it was a 10-point Likert scale or a 7-point Likert scale, all these things were very hard for us to find out. Then the reproducibility part, like I said, we have only articles with open data, so we could go into the data and check whether they actually found measurement invariance, whether we could reproduce it, or we could do it ourselves. But as you can understand, maybe this is a very, very long process and it's very frustrated, and we hadn't finished in time for today to actually present the results. But luckily, we also did a pilot study, and in this pilot study, we also did a reproducibility part that we're going to discuss quite quickly now. Our pilot study consisted of 3 journals, again +1, again psychological science, and the Journal of Judgment and Decision Making. It was 60 articles. 60 articles contained 120 comparisons. Of those, 36 did a group time comparison with a reflective factor, so 36 should have done a measurement invariance check. 30 of those had open data. Even though we only sampled articles that shared their data, only 30 of those could actually, of those 36 could be found. 25 were interpretable, so if we could not open the data, or if the variables had no names, we basically did not know what we were looking at and we could not do anything. Of those 25, we were able to run a measurement invariance analysis in 15. Sometimes the model was too complex, sometimes the sample size was too small and the model did not converge. In 11 of those, measurement invariance holds, 1 configural, 4 metric, and 6 scalar. So even though data is reported to be shared, it's not guaranteed that it's actually shared, accessible, or interpretable. Only in 40% we actually found the level of measurement invariance that was needed. And yeah, conclusions regarding the rest, we cannot be certain. We cannot know for certain that these conclusions are valid. Of course, our study had some limitations. Our inclusion criteria were quite strict. So any psychological measure that did not use a reference psychometric property or internal consistency, we did not include. These were often experimental tasks, like for example, reaction time. We only compared categorical grouping variables, male, female, treatment control, but we did not use any continuous grouping variables. And as you can see, many studies dropped out. So our sample size was too small to conduct statistical tests, and it's nested. So it's quite hard to do any statistical inference on this data. Then we want to end with some recommendations, what we can ask from researchers to do. And the main thing, I guess, is clear. If you compare psychological constructs across groups, do a measurement invariance test, because we want to make sure that the difference found between groups is actually difference between groups and not measurement difference between groups. We heard yesterday already, share your data. We also want to add, share your code, because we like your data, but we also need your code to actually reproduce the results. You can do so on the Open Science Framework. We would like you to use validated scales. Don't add or remove items, or if you do, try to make a validated scale again, so try to validate it in different samples. Report, report, report. What is not reported cannot be understood by others. Makes sense, I think. And as we heard yesterday, also consider testing for any behavioral measures. So we talked about the sniff test yesterday in the other symposium. Those are also applicable for measurement invariance. So basically, human behavior that is tested should be checked to see whether there are appropriate measurements. Then, in the interest of time, I'm not going to show you, but our slides are online in the Google Drive. What we want to make clear is doing a measurement invariance check is relatively easy. You can use R, which is a free program. And as you can see, it's only a few lines of code. You load your data, you fit, you define your model, you run 2 lines, and you can see what kind of measurement invariance there is. This is for configural invariance. Metric is basically the same, and then scalar is the same. If you have any questions about this, if you want to do a measurement invariance check ourselves, please feel free to contact us, because we can help you out. And thank you for your attention. We would like to hear if there are questions. Let me check the chat. Ah, okay. Thanks, Anton. Yes? Yeah, for people online, basically our results are kind of biased because we only use open data. So the results are even more grim in studies that do not use open data. Yeah, I fully agree. There's nothing else I can say. I think it's really problematic. And I think people just don't know. They don't know that they have to do this. Even though they learn about validation, about factor analysis. Measurement invariance check is basically factor analysis in 2 groups. It's very, the step to it is not that hard, but yeah, people just don't know. And if they don't share their data, we also don't know. But I agree with you, yeah. Yeah. Do you?
One option is Bayesian. I think for small sample size there are many options to do Bayesian measurement invariance checks and just use that approach. And yeah, alternatively, I think you just need more data. It's sad to say, but if you cannot make sure that what you're measuring is exactly the same across groups, you can simply not do any mean comparison. So yeah, but yeah, if you cannot collect more data, if it's really like complex sample, it's very expensive, then definitely look into some Bayesian approaches. I agree. Yeah. I don't know if you have anything.
Can do a measurement invariance check, report it. So even if you can do it, report why you couldn't do it. So we can interpret that you didn't do it, but at least you have a justification for it. That's all I want to answer.
Okay.
Okay. Yes. Okay. We're going to move to the next presentation. Yes. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Hey, hi everyone. I'm Giulio Costantini. Today we'll tell you about our studies regarding goals for personality traits. But, oh, yeah, sorry. But first, I think you are all aware now of the reproducibility crisis. The Open Science Collaboration a few years ago in 2015 published this paper, and what we did is attempting to replicate 100 studies in major social experimental psychology journals, and the main result is that only 36% of them actually replicated a p less than 0.5. Now, what about personality psychology more specifically? Personality, there is this claim that personality traits are connected to outcomes. It could be in health domain, educational domain, work domain, etc. And this is very influential paper on the annual review of psychology 2006, very much cited, that tried to review all these personality trait outcome associations. And then comes Christopher Soto in 2019, published this paper, How Replicable Are Links Between Personality Traits and Consequential Life Outcomes. So it does a couple of extremely powerful studies and tries to replicate those associations reviewed there. Now, when I first heard of these results, it was in the pre-COVID era, so it was the last in presence European Conference of Personality, and Soto asked what I'm about to ask you. How many of them do you think replicated, considering that the power based on the original effect size was very, very, very high? Try to think of a number. 50%, you say. Anybody offering more than 50? It is 87.2. It's a lot. Because also the effect sizes, whereas in the Open Science Collaboration study, there were replication effect sizes about half the original ones. In personality, they were closer. I mean, this is not perfect. If we trusted the power analysis made on the original effect sizes, nearly all of them should have replicated. So the effect sizes are not as large. Once you correct them for unreliability, they are slightly smaller. But I mean, we can say that personality psychology doesn't have this so huge reproducibility crisis. Why is that? Well, it could be because personality psychologists are dispositionally honest people. I don't think so. I think that one reason could be that in personality, we run more correlational studies, broad correlational studies. We are interested in broader pattern correlation, not in testing a specific hypothesis. So essentially, we may have lower incentives to question our research practices. Also, the standards of the field require typically larger sample sizes and the measure more established. Typically, we have a long tradition of building measures, so we may have fewer problems of that kind. Another interesting result that Soto pointed out is that studies are replicated better if there was correspondence between the original and the replication measurement strategy. So the same, for example, self-report and self-report, and if the items were similar or the same. But is everything okay in personality psychology? We may have more of a theory crisis. This is a nice paper that Ronan and Brinkman recently published, and they discuss the theory crisis in psychology, and I think it applies very well to personality as well. So why do we have a theory crisis? So we don't have strong theories like in physics or other strong fields. First, we lack strong phenomena. So if you want to make a contribution, theoretical contribution in particle physics, you have to deal with a body of established phenomena that constrain your theorizing. In psychology, that is not always true. We have this phenomena, but this phenomena only true under certain moderating condition, and sometimes, and this has to do with replicability, they simply are not there. So you cannot trust the literature, and even when something is established, it's not a strong phenomenon in the sense that it applies always under all conditions. In personality psychology, we also have another problem, which is overlap among constructs. So many constructs are vaguely defined, and they tend to overlap with each other. And as a consequence, when you want to establish, for example, causal relationship, and you attempt to do manipulation, you end up doing what they call a fat hand manipulation. So instead of manipulating specifically what you want to manipulate, you end up manipulating many other things that you cannot control. Let's take a closer look to some trait outcome association. This is not from the Soto study. They were pointed out by other authors, Ukuvainen, Karenamotus. Neuroticism predicts body mass index. That's true. So the more neurotic, the higher your body mass index. Extraversion predicts life satisfaction and well-being. Well, plausible. Extraversion also predicts less fragility in older age. It seems all fine, except that the first is driven by items in assessment of neuroticism that are specifically related to eating too much. The second one, driven by items related to positive emotion. Third one, driven by items related to being active and living. So that, I mean, makes this trait outcome association less interesting, at least. So a step toward moving forward and could be having a systematic approach to research from early stages. So from when you define constructs and you generate items to assess them. And then in this process, which is often left to the subjectivity of the researcher, when possible, try to use independent raters to reduce the subjectivity involved. And of course, if you have this systematic exploratory research, you can also share your data, share your code, increase the reproducibility and replicability in the future. So I will now tell you a little bit about our specific interest, which is in personality, traits, and goals. Why goals in personality? Well, recent research, and this is a very interesting paper that influenced a lot my current studies. They showed that goals, personal goals that you may feel important in some moment or more continuously in time, well, they have contemporaneous level and even causal relationship with trait-related manifestations. We have also shown that the momentary experience of goals related to conscientiousness specifically predict manifestation of conscientiousness at the subsequent point in time. This is still under review. Also, people have been shown to be able to change their traits if they have goals to change a specific trait. And procedure based on goals have also been shown to be able to specifically change some aspects of some traits. However, the field is still missing a taxonomy of goals that are specifically related to personality traits. Let's take a look at what could be a problem if you want to do this. Few years ago, Wilter pointed out that traits combine and trait assessment combine aspects that are behavioral, cognitive, and also motivational. If you inspect the HEXACO 100, this is a very widely used instrument and a very good one, I guess. But if you want to investigate the trait-goal relationship and you read the items, well, you find out that you may have a problem. These are items of personality. If I want something from personality like, I would ask very nicely word, blah, blah, blah. But the first part is a goal. I want something from a personality like. I often check my work over repeatedly to find any mistakes, and that's a goal. So you have goal content built in items. So you have to take care of it. So our aim was to develop an assessment of goals related to traits and a taxonomy of goals related to traits. We didn't want them to overlap to traits and to trait assessment. So we started from the adjective tradition in personality. We have a long tradition in assessing and identifying personality traits based on adjective single word descriptors such as honest, conscientious, extrovert, etc. And we also wanted to sample goals at different abstraction levels, so very concrete and very abstract. And we wanted at this stage of research to strive for comprehensiveness. And we focus on HEXACO traits other than conscientiousness. So first, what is HEXACO? You probably have heard of the big 5 traits. To very quickly sum up, they still just like the big 5, but there are 6 instead of 5. So big, broad personality traits: honesty, humility, emotionality, extroversion, agreeableness versus anger, conscientiousness, and openness to experience. We did not consider conscientiousness because we have published research specifically on the motivational aspect of conscientiousness, but I want to show you not the published studies, the newer studies, because we improved our pipeline a bit. Our pipeline is currently includes 3 studies. First one is systematical exploratory study to identify content units that are relevant for goals. So we elicited goal content from the bottom up. We used independent raters to identify meaningful content units. We clustered the ratings based on the ratings to identify specific content units. Then we developed a questionnaire based on those units. Then we refined the item set and try to identify specific goals with hierarchical clustering and more general dimension describing those goals with principal component analysis. In the third studies, we tried to replicate the PCI structure, and we collected initial validity evidence. So, in the first study, what we did is selecting 16 adjectives by trait, trying to cover all main aspects of traits, both goals, all the most important phases. Participants were instructed about what is and what is not a goal. We did this capitalizing on what we learned from past studies. So participants often tell you situation in which something is important or causes of behavior. We instructed them specifically that they were not valid answers. They gave them anyway, so, but at least we tried to limit this. And then we asked them for each adjective to answer these questions. Why do you or would you behave in an, for example, honest way? And in the second step, to elicit also more abstract goals, we asked them, you indicated that you do or would behave in a honest way for the following reason. I don't know, for example, be liked by others. Why is this, or could this be important to you? Examples of answers, just to have a look, are why you would be distrustful? Well, prevent someone from getting close to me, hurting me, particularly in case we develop a sentimental relationship. At the second step, avoiding pain. So a more abstract goal. The last one is also fun. Dishonest. Why would you behave in a dishonest way? Hide that I cheated on my partner. Why? Because I want to avoid losing someone alone. So we sampled all these answers. We got more than 7,000 of them. And we now wanted to have a procedure to identify meaningful content units. So we used 5 independent raters, and they first classify each response as a goal or a non-goal. For example, vague answers, causes of behavior, also responses that included illegitimate adjectives. So I want to be honest with others. They were removed to avoid overlap between traits and goals. Then all raters grouped goals into classes freely. They were instructed to group goals that had the same meaning, that overlapped in content. And in both cases, we got good inter-rater consistency. But still, we did not have content units because we did not have, of course, perfect overlap in the ratings. So what we did is build a network. The nodes of the network represent the goals, individual answers. And the edges, an edge was drawn between 2 nodes if the majority of raters rated those 2 goals as having the same meaning. Then we used a clustering algorithm on that, and we identified 269 content units, more specific content units. So in the second study, 2 authors work in parallel to generate items. We generated a lot of them, trying to cover all the content of the units, starting from bigger units and moving to smaller units. Often those smaller units included content that was, for example, extremely specific or already covered by other categories. So we didn't have as many items as content units. We administered the items to participants, and together with 2 assessments of HEXACO traits, one based on adjectives, and one is the established measure, questionnaire measure, the HEXACO 100. And first, we clustered those answers, the items to find specific units, and then we used those results to refine the questionnaire a little bit. For example, we removed items that did not overlap in content with the cluster. That were only 5 items which were really thought with the other items in the cluster. Maybe this is some sampling variability. We removed cluster that did not share variance with personality traits because our interest was identifying goals related to traits. And then we added items for the next study to compensate for cluster whose reliability was too low. we ended up with a little fewer cluster and little more items. And 8 components emerged according to parallel analysis. The meaning were prosociality, superiority, happiness and growth, avoiding pain, assertiveness, closeness and feelings, tradition and rebellion. But these are not the goals. These are specific, broad content that allows us to quickly summarize the content dimensions in the goal. So these are examples of the clusters that ended up in prosociality and of the items that we used to assess them. And in the last study, we collected initial validity evidence. So we had a larger sample size. All people completed the goal questionnaire. And subsamples completed also assessments of HEXACO traits and of values. Interestingly, the component structure replicated with Akker congruence coefficient between 0.91 and 0.99. So not exactly the same. These can be interpreted as correlation between the factors in the first and in the second study. In second and the third study, they were not identical. There were some small differences, but it was a good overlap. We inspected the relationship with HEXACO traits, but I won't go into the detail of this. They had correlations with HEXACO traits, and most of them were consistent, independent of the use of the questionnaire measure and the adjective measure, but some of them were different. So that's important to know, because the adjectives are, we consider them more informative because they don't have these item overlap issues. And also these broad dimensions describing goal, unsurprisingly, also correlated with some of the broad dimension describing values. I only present here the very broad dimension of values, and of course for brevity, otherwise there would be lots of specific results. But that's mostly it. And in conclusion, well, we should bear in mind that constructs define items, but also items define constructs. So we need to keep that in mind when we do research in personality, perhaps also not only in personality. And questionnaire development is never fully reproducible. So even though we try to make our choices as transparent, as reproducible as possible, you may have noticed that many of them were subjective, and it was, impossible to eliminate completely subjectivity involved. But systematic exploratory studies and a documentation of the research from these earlier stages could be important to allow others to replicate your results from an earlier stage, not taking, for example, your measures and your constructs for granted. And of course, this allowed to discuss transparently the strategies for limiting explanation overlap. Future development, I'm generating specific assessment of goals related to each trait that we could use for temporal and experimental studies to better investigate the relationship between personality traits and goals. And we will also plan to extend these studies to specifically with an in-depth investigation in honesty, disposition on honesty. We got recently funded for this research on honesty, and we are also have a postdoc position opening. So if you're interested, contact me. And thank you. I want to thank Francesca Mottola, Gabriella Salvato, Assunta Chiara, Lucrezia Santis, and Rosa Zito. They served as independent raters, so they did a very long job classifying all those 7,000 answers. And I also want to thank the people who collaborated, Marco Perugini from University of Milan di Cocca, Ida Sergio, Augusto Misi, again, Francesca Mottola from University Vanvitelli of Campania. And thank you for your attention. Okay, I'm trying to check, but I.
Okay. No online question.
more than only personality psychology. I mean, this is something that I think we start. We are particularly aware of in personality psychology. We do have a tradition, for example, the lexical tradition as a really systematic way of defining the concept, starting from less subjective criteria as possible. So in personality, I think we are more aware of this. In other fields, maybe people are less aware. It doesn't matter for, of course, I don't think it matters for all the fields of psychology. Many don't use even self-report items. So, but when you do use, I think you should inspect what's in your measures instead of just trusting the label of the construct. That's the take-home message I would like to give you. Thank you very much.
Okay, is that online? Well, those were three fantastic talks, and I will refer also to the talk by Andrea that unfortunately the last minute could not be present, but I will refer to her too. So you all know about the crisis in psychology, and around 2011, of course, you know probably the very important article by Simons, Nelson, and Simonson about, was the first one talking about researcher degrees of freedom. And it was like, oh, there are all these false positive and lack of replication, of course, p-hacking, because that article showed that with p-hacking, you can get whatever you want. And of course, was hinting to the problems of fraud. And 2011 was the time also, as you well know, unfortunately in Holland, the case of Strapel case and the Sana at the University of Michigan and so on. So, but recently in 2018, same author, Nelson, Simons, and Simonson wrote in Annual Review of Psychology, this article saying, Psychology's Renaissance. And they said, incredibly, from 2011 to 2018, we saw finally publishing replication attempts. We saw more and more replication, pre-registration, enormous increase in sample sizes, and of course, the request of full disclosure that you can see, open materials, open data, open code. So the talks that you have seen today, they are all showing how we will move to this. And actually even more than 2018. And I will, if I can, briefly mention the importance of the work that's been done by the people presented here. So let's start from the work that about meta-analyzing the multiverse. Well, the problems with the selective reporting, in fact, in that article in 2011, it was shown selective reporting is a disaster. And it's been so well shown that I put it mildly here as a possible cause of study bias, but it's really showing that probably, you know, why there are so many false positives? Well, because selective reporting, as they have shown with the multiverse, meta-analyzing the multiverse, you can get whatever you want. So why? Because how do you deal with missing observation? Often it's been not said. How you do with exclusion of participants? Nothing been said. Different data processing, different modeling decision, nothing gets said. And the example, in fact, they use is about the young adults, for example, as the age group. I've seen so many articles, and I have to say, especially in social cognition, it uses university students. Well, you read about and it says we use young university students, and then all of a sudden you say, well, but we use only the 18 to 22. And I'm thinking, what happened to the people who are 23, 24, 25? There may be good reason to exclude those just older people. But if you don't tell me, how they responded, what I know about it. So you can see clearly a bias. I will mention about the work that Andrea would have talked about here, about that I'm knowledgeable about because I published a work on gender differences in mathematics and stereotype threat with a group at the University of Padua. Looking at all the literature, immense literature now, trying to explain gender differences in mathematics, both in adults and children and adolescents, they talk about mathematics and they use problems. You never know how many problems they use. Are they 20? Are they 30? You don't know. Not only if they said it, they say, for the theory to work, you have to have difficult problems. Because if it's not difficult, you don't have a decrement in performance in the women. Well, what does it mean difficult? If you don't test it, if you don't tell me, the articles especially, but you can see that if you do, and we will talk later about that, if you have the documentation online, as now is so easy to do, in some ways you can know number of problems, number of difficulty, and so on, everything you know. But the entire area, careers built just on this, without knowing the data, let's say. So I said, of course you've seen by Anton when from Holland, he was showing to you that the results differ across so many alternative analytic outcomes. And so you can see that what biases could have emerged if the studies had not been pre-registered and could have been subjected to selective reporting. So you can see the importance of pre-registration. It's just it just changes completely the biases. And you have seen the incredible, even for people, we don't even have good intuition about this. We don't, because you should think when you read an article, this is before pre-registration, today, you should see the scaling decided post-hoc, how they did the composite score. What they do about, you don't know about missingness of the dependent variable. You don't know anything about, as I said before, the example of age. You just don't know, and so on. And it will, when selecting reporting results, researchers may exhibit different behaviors. And it's very interesting that they show you that the worst case scenario is what's called maybe the level most significant. As in the past, you know that there's, if you look at some research of like 10 years ago, you can see very significant. Now the manual, the APA manual say, don't use very significant, it means nothing, of course. And so they use most significant because that's the most extreme selection results caused by p-hacking. So I then pass to the second presentation today, excellent by Damiano and Esther. And it's interesting because there is now a huge literature on the question of research practice and selection of variables and so on. It could be one. Way less, and probably people in this room are aware of, but less, and maybe less is being taught also to doctoral students and postdocs, maybe, about questionable measurement practices. And so instead of having QRPs, you call them QMPs. Less known, but as important. Of course, the lack of information about measure could be due to ignorance. It's unfortunate that you need methodological training. Negligence, and there we go again. It is negligence. You wonder, you know, there is this continuum between not doing it right because you don't know about, but maybe you're getting, and I'm not saying it's fraud, but surely there is this continuum to something that you don't know about, but to something you do on purpose to get, you know, your statistically significant results. Or I said misrepresentation. Thank you. Or a combination of these factors. Yeah. So there is this article that has been referred, thank you, Place and Pride in 2020, that they call a measurement, questionable measurement practices and how to avoid them. It's an excellent article in line with what you have presented. And I think, again, I say, if you take care about, well, as the second part of your talk by Esther, is shows extreme poor reporting on measurement invariance. Most of those who have to do measurement invariance, we don't know, maybe they do it, but they do not report it. In fact, at a certain point, you put report. If you do it, and we think they don't do it, but if you do, then report it. So this shows the importance of transparency. As you remember, I started a talk about saying registration, and especially this transparency means put, you know, your open material, your open code, and in this case, of course, how you check for measurement invariance. It was funny because in this article by Flake and Fried, it said something that I think there was a question by the person sitting by you about, you know, about sample size. They talk about the example of depression and traits about depression, how you measure depression, which is of course extremely important in clinical judgment. And they conclude a part of their article saying, even if the sample size when you do depression studies is increased, now people do, studies may be adequately powered, because you know in the past, you know, we know it was, you know, low power, low sample size and so on. Analytic, even you can see analytic strategies are pre-registered, so we are getting to a good point. MPAction stops, all good, but researchers can still be left wondering if they were ever measuring depression at all. And that's where we get to your contra when you talk about the theory about it. So even though Andrea is not here, but I think it would have been wonderful to have her here to talk about her area, which is gender differences in mathematics and stereotype threat. Stereotype threat has been a theory that has been posed that, well, if there are negative stereotypes, women are not good in mathematics, well, you can have an experimental manipulation that activates this negative stereotype, and you should be seeing a decrement in the women performance, not the men, but the women. Well, there's a huge area of, as I said before, both in adult social cognition and in developmental cognition, and showing that this is a very, in fact, Introductory to Psychology manual present this as absolutely true. Well, they said it's not true because there's a lot of inconsistencies in stereotype threat effects. And Floor and Dickert, Tilburg University, they did a meta-analysis of a lot of published and unpublished studies with all the children and adolescents younger than 18. And they found a small effect. It's negative because the way it's calculated, but small, but the effect is being found almost always in underpowered studies and small scale studies, not in the good studies. So but if you then the same group, and Andrea is doing it in Holland now, this is a study done with 2,000 finally 40-year-old Dutch high school students. They checked for the present voice, difficulty of the math test. They found no evidence of stereotype threat effect on math performance. We, at the University of Padua, we replicated also a study with 14 and 16, found no, also large sample size study, we found no evidence. So why is this controversy? There is publication bias, clearly, p-hacking all over, p-hacking in this literature. And of course now, Andrea with Vickers and Floor and Stoevenbelt, they are looking at maybe what's happening, that stereotype is a negative stereotype, may change over time, change in different countries. And in fact, they are checking it, but they have pre-registered the hypothesis, the methods, the materials, the analysis, everything pre-registered. They are replicating a study done in adults. There was originally minus 0.77, and they found in 4 universities, Tilburg and University of Vienna, if I heard, 4 different studies, practically nothing. So, and this has been pre-registration, so you can look it up, redo the analysis if you want, as much. Now we come to the end, and Costantini presented them in 3 enormous studies, I would say. And what's interesting about your study, which is the link between reproducibility and theories, which probably, well, the last one probably has more link with the theory, but very important, the link between theory and personality item. I found that this idea to get the bottom-up approach very important, but because it's a combination I've seen with the network analysis and expert ratings. But again, the strength of all what you have done is because it's like, yes, it's an exploratory bottom-up studies, but what you have is the careful documentation of all the steps involved, both in the data collection and the analysis. So I think all 4 studies are, as I started, we said, well, we have a crisis in psychology. I don't think the crisis is still finished. And, you know, the number falls positive, enormous lack of replication, because we have seen then over and over. I've checked in the last 10 years in psychological science, and I looked for articles between 2010 and 2020. And I've seen now, I looked at 10 studies that were published in that period and 10 replication. And now finally, you can see this replication, and so often, practically, they don't find anything. But could it be that the original study, well, p-hacking definitely was, and I think the article that was presented by Anton also, you know, the importance of you have seen the meta-analyzing metaverse is like incredible. Even by intuition, you don't know the amount of combination that you can have. And so I said also fraud. I'm sorry, you know, when we did also here in Italy study about questionable research practices, we also asked self-admission, did you ever admit to having falsified, actually fabricate data? I think we have falsified data, slightly different, but 2% of Italian psychologists responded. And that 2% is also in the original work by John in the United States, in Germany too, even though the authors there said, no, it's not so bad, questionable research practice, not so bad, but people more than almost 3%. And this 2 to 3% seems to be what's acceptable. But this is self-admission. These are people who say, they admit. So, you know, we wonder. And it is not multiply data. As I was saying before, there is this continuum where you can do things with p-hacking. And I was, so somebody says, oh, I think it was also Anton maybe was talking about that you can do unintentional because of confirmation bias, and then you're doing p-hacking is intentional. My feeling is even confirmation bias, we are aware of, you know, unless you do research without in the sky, without thinking. But if you're doing research thinking about as a researcher, you are aware that you will try. This is a natural reasoning process. We try to confirm our own hypotheses. So I don't think it is completely unintentional, but it could be considered less severe, but you can see that all these strategies to get your results, the results you want, because you want to publish, because in the past, that's the way it was, it's, you know, with a question mark about how ethical these behaviors are. But on the positive side, that is being represented by the people here present, we can say, yes, there is a psychological renaissance. We see publishing replication attempts, and all of you are talking about pre-registration, and as shown with, there is of course an increase in sample sizes. We've been your study, Giulio is an immense study, 3 actually, and all of you have talked about full disclosure. The open materials, open data, open code, and sharing the data to, even if there are honest errors, it can be fixed, but not the other type of errors. Thank you. I think there is time for questions.
When talking about information bias, I'm thinking about the previous presentation of the stereotype. I wonder also how much extra sensitivity we think over in this kind of bias to some extent. I have the feeling that sometimes findings that are against some beliefs there among scientists are it's harder to be disproved. I think that our researchers think twice about publishing a study that finds like a group difference, for instance, that would not be very welcome by the scientific community. A similar behavior has been done also about video games. Like, there's more panic about violent video games, but actually the research doesn't really show an effect of video games on aggression. Another example about social media, everybody thinks that social media is bad.
Yes, yeah.
So, I mean, it's not really, you know, like this, the feminism is nothing to do with connection starting on the American psychology about these issues that there are issues that do not seem to be related to replication, but
yeah. And I think it's a very interesting point because, of course, as a researcher, we have to be socially also, you know, aware. So you mentioned, you know, the article, the very famous article by Ioannidis, that talked about false positive. He said that there were many reasons why people publish a false positive. And he listed, for example, of course, like drug companies, they have a money economic reason. Unfortunately, they're not, you know, doing it because of the benefit of society. So he said that when there are, but that's a bad part. In the if you take it, they could be also what's called politically correct. So especially in social psychology, and that's why you mentioned a stereotype threat. Of course, if I think about myself, I don't want gender differences in mathematics. You know, we are all here. We want women to do as well as men. And so there could be, as you said, some shared belief that is better to attribute some gender. You know, you don't want, as a woman, for example, you don't want to say, never say there is a biological explanation, even if the biological explanation would explain, and I realize there's a bias. There's a bias that comes from wanting equality, which is a good, but when you do research, you should really, really kind of try to abstain from your own bias and try to do correct link between theory and the data. If the data that you collect do not support the theoretical point, even if it goes against your own personal belief. I think it's a good point. And it's actually the point of the, I think, behind this controversy, the controversy. Yeah. Yes. Well, exactly. This is the problem. In Italy, this is a bad problem. In the afternoon after this, we're going to have a symposium on research ethics. And I will exactly talk about this, because I will say what questionable research practices are horrible for science, but what at the moment why people did it? To publish and publish fast. Unless we change, and we change the incentive for a number of publications, especially for younger people who have to, you know, there is a career opportunity, nothing will change, unfortunately. And that's, you know, and first of all, the editorial policies have to change. They have to look for quality, not, you know, for quantity. And people make decisions, you know, the older professor make decision, should give incentive, what you call slow science. And I don't call it slow, I call good science. And instead, what we have seen, and all your talks are, bad science. Unfortunately, bad science is fast. Good science requires time, requires energy. The work that the two of you have presented takes enormous amount of, the work on stereotype threat and children that collect flora at Tilburg University, years. The work that I mentioned, University of Padova, that we did, it took 4 years to publish it. Because also then you get encounter, for the reason that you actually mentioned also, stopping. Reviewers don't want, for example, reviewers don't like this failure to replicate. They don't like this, especially when the problem is that you are attacking because the reviewer may be the person who published bad work. So you really have pointed out where, you know, it's not enough to do good work, something has to change. And we hope they will.